Howdy, folks. Today we're going to learn about the principles of American government, topic 1.6 from College Board. The objective is we're going to explain the constitutional principles of separation of powers and checks and balances, the powers allocated to Congress, the president, and the courts, demonstrate the separation of powers and checks and balances of the Constitution. We will explain the implications of separation in powers and checks and balances for the U.S. political system, and multiple access points for stakeholders and institutions to influence public policy flow from the separation of powers and checks and balances. When we think about the principles of American government, the two focuses will be the separation of powers and checks and balances. First, in the separation of powers, ultimately outlined in Federalist 51 by James Madison, is that the division of power into three branches of government. And remember, there are three branches as outlined in the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution describes the powers of the legislative branch, which includes Congress, which is the House of Representatives, and the United States Senate. Article 2 of the Constitution focuses on the executive branch, which is the President. And Article 3 focuses on the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. The key goal is to give each branch very specific powers so that one branch doesn't have the ability to accumulate too much power. The goal is to limit government. It's also important to note that the separation of powers makes things pretty inefficient, very inefficient. The Founding Fathers prefer to have things that are done in Washington be done inefficiently so that there's not constant change and upheaval. That change requires slow, meticulous change and effort from all three branches of government to occur. Second, checks and balances, that each branch can limit the powers of the others. President can limit Congress in very specific ways. The president can limit the Supreme Court in very specific ways. The Supreme Court can limit the president in very specific ways, and the Congress can also limit the Congress. And also Congress can limit the president and the Supreme Court or the judicial branch. Again, the goal is to limit government. We do not want to allow the federal government to have overreach. We do not want to have a federal government that can become King George in terms of what the colonists experienced during the Revolutionary period. Remember, when the Constitution is created, King George and the Revolutionary War and that fear of abuse of government is still in the minds of the Founding Fathers. And again, the checks and balances does create an inefficient government. And that's what the Founding Fathers wanted. If you want to focus on the specifics and to go look back to more about this, please refer to pages 28 to 30 in your textbook. To go deeper into the separation of powers, we keep in mind that the three branches have very specific expectations and roles and powers. Congress passes laws. The executive branch carries out or executes the law. And the judicial branch interprets the law. The Constitution sets out a clearly defined roles and responsibilities of each branch. There are some overlaps, however, and that's where conflict can occur between branches. For example, when we think of the military and the powers of the military, two branches of government can claim responsibility and power. Congress can say, hey, we have the power over the military because we have the ability to declare war, as outlined in the Constitution. However, the president will say, I have the ability to control and have power over the military because I was given the power of commander-in-chief of the military. A reminder, the goal is to clearly define these roles and powers, even though there is some overlap, to limit the power of government. We don't want to have all the military power within the executive branch or the legislative branch because that would give one branch of government too much power. Yes, we want to limit government, and yes, it creates an inefficient government, but it's what the Founding Fathers wanted. In terms of checks and balances, this is talking about how the Constitution outlines clearly defined roles and responsibilities with the specific purpose to limit the other branches. This leads to purposeful conflict between branches. The Founding Fathers wanted branches to have conflict and argue and discuss who should be doing what. An example would be passing laws. Congress has the power to pass laws with both houses of Congress that can pass legislation. They gave the power of veto to the president. The president can cancel that legislation passed by the House and the Senate. However, Congress, if it has enough people in the House and the Senate, Congress can override that veto with 2/3 of vote in both houses. That in itself is allowing the executive to check the legislative branch, but it also allows the legislative branch to continue to check the president. The goal is to limit the government. We want the president to limit Congress. We want Congress to limit the president. And we also want the judicial branch to limit both of the other branches as well. If you look at this chart, you will see how the three branches of government can check each other and maintain the balance of power between those branches. Again, this is an inefficient way to conduct government, but it's what the Founding Fathers wanted. They were trying to prevent tyranny from the federal government. As we move forward, we're going to start to think about how do these checks and balances look in action? How does separation of powers, how does that look in the real world? Not everything is clearly defined in terms of those roles and responsibilities. And both checks and balances and separation of powers leads to Congress between all three branches of government.